that we are going to be presenting now with Anna Bash is about data issues that you are most likely going to encounter when you're trying to develop a measure. These are things that we actually deal with every time we have to create a measure for any country, even for the global MPI that we already have the methodology, the dimensions, the indicators. These issues are still relevant for every survey that we work with. Some of these issues already came up yesterday when a few of you were talking about what do we do when we have missing values for some particular indicators or for some particular households, and how do we work in that case. So that's part of what we are going to cover today. That's just one of the topics that we are going to be talking about. Actually, we're going to go through all this outline. First, we are going to talk about which are the sources of information that gives us enough data to compute a multidimensional measure. Then we're going to talk a little bit about household surveys design and what type of indicators do we use and how do we get them to be at the right level depending on the unit of analysis. And then we're also going to talk about what's the applicable population, and more details on what it is an applicable population will come later. Combined measures, and then at the end about missing values, inconsistencies, sample drop, and bias analysis, and how this all enters into a multidimensional measure. So we're going to start first, as it's here in the outline, with the sources of multidimensional poverty measures. Basically, as you saw in the last few days, when you want to create a multidimensional measure, like the Alkire-Foster M0 for a particular country or a particular group of people, you need to have a unique source of information that is giving you microdata for all the individuals or all the households that you are going to be including in that measure. You cannot use aggregate level data. You cannot use the average years of schooling in the country from one source and the proportion of households that don't have access to sanitation from another source. You need all the information to come from the same instrument, the same households. It doesn't have to be household survey, but from the same source of data, and it has to go down to the level of the unit of analysis. It's what we call microdata, because we don't use aggregates, but rather we go to the level of detail of the unit of analysis. So if we talk about households, we need data at the household level. And if we talk about individuals, we're going to need individual data. Now, there are different sources of information from which we can get microdata that is usable or that can be used for multidimensional analysis. One of them are the census. Now, everybody knows what a census is. Every country has a census nowadays. It's just an enumeration sorry, of all the households or all the individuals that belong to some well-defined territory for a particular moment in time. National census happen every 5 to 10 years. Most countries carry census every 10 years. And they cover a limited number of variables that have to do with demographics like age, ethnicity, marital status, gender, some educational variables like literacy or educational attainment, some variables on housing, and sometimes there are also some additional information like economic status, whether the person is employed or not, type of employment, but that's additional information that it's added and that it's not usual, that it's not always available, or at least not in every census. Now, one of the main advantages of a census is that it's covering almost the entire population, or it's supposed to cover the entire population for a particular moment in time. So we are able to get estimates with negligible error at the moment that we want to get estimates. And that's one of the main advantages that we have in this, when we use this kind of source of information. And also that we can go down and decompose by district or by subnational regions. Like we saw yesterday for the case of the SAMPI of South Africa, they are able to construct these maps and tables at the district level, something that is not usually possible with other sources of information because of the sample size. But there are also some disadvantages of this kind of source of information. One of the main being the fact that they are carried not very frequently. Imagine that you are in the government and you have to wait for 10 years for the next census to be able to track poverty. It's not actually going to be very useful in terms of policy design. So that is a big restriction or a big limitation of this type of data source. And again, as I was mentioning before, they have information on various dimensions, but it's usually quite limited. There might be a lot of dimensions that we consider to be relevant or indicators that are relevant for our analysis that are not directly included in the census. And so this also gives us, limits the scope of the analysis that we are able to do with the census. And finally, even though tables and reports from the census are usually publicly available, it's much more difficult to get access to the microdata. It's very difficult for a researcher to get access to microdata. So while the Statistical Bureau of the or the government in a particular country can work with that data for national purposes or for a national measure, for research, if you have a research objective or if you're trying to get a lot of people to be constructing measures, they are not going to be able to access the data, and therefore there's no actually going to be a measure that is implemented. Now, the second type of source of information that can be used when we are constructing a multidimensional measure is administrative data. In this case, it's usually some agency or department from the government that is collecting data already just for administrative purposes. So imagine, for example, birth records or death records or tax accounts. These are records that already exist, so they represent no additional cost for the government at the moment of getting the data. The data is already there. It's there for everyone already. When we think about birth history, for example, everybody's already registered. So there is no need actually to go and carry out a new survey or to implement a new questionnaire. The data is already available. But again, the information is going to be limited. If we had a birth record, for example, it's only going to have a few questions about the time of birth, how many months of pregnancy, the weight at birth, maybe a few other characteristics, maybe some characteristics about the mother, but that's it. We are not going to be able to have information on employment or education or many other health characteristics that are also important. So these records are usually limited to one topic or to one scope, and so it's difficult to use them for a more for a broader measure of poverty, for example. And at the same time, these records are subject to changes or adjustments over time, and this can make it more difficult to make trends or to make comparisons over time. And again, it's not usually available for researchers or for the general public to access these records. They are usually just used by the government. So a third option, which is the most commonly source of information for multidimensional measures, are household surveys. Basically, there are a lot of household surveys that are available. The data is available online, like the ones that we use for the global MPI, the DHS, and the mixed surveys. You only have to register online, and then you have access to 300 surveys that are there online for you to use in the type of analysis that you want to do. And a lot of countries also have their own national surveys available online. So now it's become easier to create measures using this type of data. Another advantage is that they usually cover a wide range of topics. So there is usually a lot of information. Housing information is usually there, education, employment. Some have information on health. Some surveys have information on expenditure or income. Some surveys have additional modules on other topics that they consider to be relevant for each country. Some of the problems here is that, first of all, we are not actually covering the entire population. This is a survey that is carried over a sample, which is designed to be representative of the country, sometimes urban-rural, sometimes even subnational regions or districts, depending on the sampling design. But it's not going to be without error. In this case, we are going to have some error when we are getting our figures. And even though most countries nowadays have some sort of household survey, they are still not as frequent as we would like for the main source of information for a poverty, the source that we are going to use for our poverty measure. Basically, there are many countries in the world in which their household surveys are still conducted every 5 years. And still, if we want to see the impact, for example, of a natural disaster on people, or the impact of the financial crisis, or the impact of, or the positive impact of some national anti-poor program, for example, we might not be able, because we have to wait for 5 years, and that might be even the next political term, even the next president. So maybe that's not completely useful for a president even though they exist. And now the number of surveys, as Sabina was showing in one of her sessions on Monday, even though the number of surveys that are available has increased enormously in the last couple of decades, it's still, their frequency is still not the best. At the same time, their coverage is also limited. As we were discussing before, in the case of DHS, for example, they only have nutritional information for children under 5 and women in reproductive age. And so they are, for some questions, they are only covering some particular groups. But then there are groups that are not covered at all. People that are institutionalized because they are at hospitals or they are in prison, people that live in slums. These are people that are not usually surveyed. And these are groups that we could all agree that are particularly vulnerable. Or indigenous people, or people that live in rural areas which are very isolated. Sometimes they are not included in the survey itself, and so we are actually missing information for groups that are particularly vulnerable to a situation of poverty. And then finally, there are also some issues with dimensional coverage, and in this is something that we have been repeating in our sessions, which is basically that there are a lot of dimensions that we could all agree that are relevant for poverty to identify people as poor, but that are not included in the surveys. Even though if household surveys have information on the employment status of an individual, what type of job they do, they usually don't have enough information about the quality. For example, if they are doing some kind of hazardous work, if they are dealing with a lot of noise, or they are dealing with chemicals that could be dangerous for their work, and if they are using their necessary uniforms or protections to avoid problems, that's not usually available. We don't have information on empowerment or on violence, on physical security. And that is very relevant, in particular in some countries. Like Ana was mentioning yesterday, in the case of El Salvador, they have included in their, they are now working on their national MPI, and they have designed a questionnaire including a whole section on violence and physical safety, because they think that in that country it's particularly relevant to have such a dimension. Now, this is not usually available, or use of time, for example. And these are all dimensions that we value and that we consider to be relevant, and still they are not yet available. So again, this is to push those of you that work in a stats bureau over here to help us to have better data and better sources to get better analysis of poverty. Okay, so this is about which are the sources. Now, just a few words on the metadata. For those of you who work with surveys, this is not something new, but basically the metadata is the data about the survey, or the data about the data. With the metadata, what they are doing is basically writing a report or putting together reports about describing the survey. So what they are doing is indicating how the sample was designed, how many people were interviewed, if there was only some particular groups that were assessed for particular variables. They are also telling us when was the fieldwork carried, and if there were any kind of problems. For example, we know that some of the regions in one country maybe weren't actually assessed because there was a flood, and so the enumerators were not able to enter that region, and so actually they are not covered in the survey, even though it's supposed to be national. So all these things are crucial when you are actually trying to get estimates from data. We cannot just simply jump into the data and start getting results, because if we don't take a look at how the survey was designed and which kind of problems they faced when they were trying to get the data, we might be missing some adjustments that we need to do. Now, in the case of the surveys that we most usually use, that are DHS and mix, and that you will be using also with your groups, there is a lot of information available for users. Every survey comes with a report, all of them, and the report has always the same structure. There is an introduction, there is a nice map of the country, so you know how the country, what's the main cities of the country, and so on. But there's also one section, entirely one section, that it's about sampling design, and they tell you about non-response, sampling errors, and all of that information, all this metadata that is so relevant for users of the data. And then they have, of course, all the tables and results, their findings, which are also crucial. Because when you are using DHS data, it's going to be important that you get a percentage of people with access to electricity that is not dramatically different from the one that they got and they revise and they check several times, right? If you get a figure that it's completely different, then that could be a warning sign that maybe there's something that we are missing in our coding or in our tabulations. Now, the reports are not enough. They are very useful, but there are a lot of steps that are usually not included in the reports of the DHS, as useful as they are, because there is a whole procedure of recoding DHS variables that, and some imputations even, that happens even before they release the data. The data that they release to the public has already been standardized in some way. There are some variables that are dropped if they consider that they are not reliable. There are some variables that are recoded based on DHS definitions, so that you can always, so in this case, if you tabulate the variable for water in DHS, it's always going to have the same, very similar categories. If you take Tanzania DHS 2010, or if you take Niger 2012-13, the categories for water are very similar because they are recoded to be in that way. However, there are always some country specificities, and that's why reading the report and reading these additional documents, it's so relevant, and it's a good practice to try to do it. They even have a whole website that is prepared for users to be able to get information as fast as possible and to get the best estimates that they can from the data. Mix has something very, very similar. They also have country reports. They publish also the questionnaires, and they also have manuals about how to use the data, how to merge the data, how recodes were done, and all this kind of information. It's also available on their own website, and they explain the sampling procedure in general and in particular for each country, and all kinds of problems that they might have faced when actually trying to carry the survey on the field. Okay, and an additional thing that is very useful when we are working with data from countries that we don't really know, it's actually try to look for any kind of information or any kind of document that was used at the moment of carrying out the survey. So it's very common in mixed surveys, and well, it's very common in all these type of surveys to add some pictures or some illustrations when they are interviewing people, because to give them a better understanding on which are the categories of sanitation or water that we are considering. So they have pictures like this that they usually take with them to the field, and they show this to each household, and they have to indicate what type of water do they have. So they have here these three categories. There are many more. These are just some examples. And here we have these two examples for sanitation, but again, there are many more categories in the services, as you will see in the data. But this is also useful because maybe in our countries, from where we are coming, maybe in our background, we don't really know what each of these categories could be and what are the difference between them. So sometimes it can be not only useful for the people that are being interviewed to know what they are being asked, but also for the analyst to make sure that we understand and that we know which each category is.
We found flying latrine. We have no idea. Flying the toilet. We tried to understand what is it. We couldn't find how a toilet can fly. So it was a confusion.
Well, yeah, things like that happen.
Yeah, so you do and then you go like.
No, things like that happens in every survey that we work with, especially there are some, as I was saying, there are some categories that are always included even if there are, if it's not a common way of, a common type of sanitation in a particular country, they do include it in the questionnaire, and then they might add 3, 4, 5 additional categories that are particularly relevant or that are specific to the country. So sometimes we see new types of sanitation, and we also have to go to the manuals, to the pictures, Google it, try to find information of what we are dealing with so that we know whether it is deprived or non-deprived. And all of these tasks are very important, and we do try to be very detailed and very precise because it makes a big difference at the end. If we are not very precise in trying to understand the different categories, we might be classifying people as deprived or non-deprived, but wrongly. Okay, so basically what we, as I was mentioning before, what it's mostly used for poverty measurement are the household surveys, microdata from household surveys. And in terms of the sample, basically there are different types of samples or different ways to draw a sample from the population that we want to study. One way would be to do what is called a simple random sample, and it's basically just to pick randomly the number of people that we want to have in the final sample out of the entire population. So in that case, everybody has the same probability of being picked, of being selected for the final, for the sample that it's actually selected. Now, that type of sampling is usually quite expensive, and it can also lead, since it's completely random, the way that we are picking people, it could lead to some groups being very underrepresented. So when we want to make comparisons across groups, it may be very complicated because maybe we have too few observations. So sometimes this works at the national level to get a figure that is nationally representative, but when we want to compare particular groups, it might be more complicated. So there are more complex ways to get the sample for a household survey, which usually involve using strata and clusters. When we talk about using strata or a stratified sample, basically what we talk is that we divide the population in groups in which the people that belong to each group are relatively similar. So it could be, for example, regions. So we know that everybody that lives in the north of the country, they are similar in the sense that they live in the north, all of them. Of course, they are not similar in all the characteristics. We just pick which is the variable that we are going to use for the stratification. Usually it's done as a combination of area, urban, rural, plus region. So we say north rural, north urban, and then we have the rest of the combinations for the rest of the country. Now, what this allows is that we can pick different variables for the stratification. So if we want to, for example, to have a measure of what's the proportion of people that have access to healthcare by ethnicity. And some ethnic groups in our country have a very small population share. In that case, if we draw a simple random sample, we might get that those particular ethnic groups, which had very low population share, might only get a few observations in the final sample. So then we cannot really compare those few observations with the rest that we got for the other ethnic groups. But if we stratify by ethnicity, then what we do is that we oversample people from those ethnic groups in order to be able to get at the end robust comparisons across ethnicity. But what we are going to have to do is that when we are doing that we are oversampling some particular groups, then the use of weights becomes very relevant, becomes crucial actually. And I'm going to talk about weights in a second. Okay. So basically what the kind of a structure that it's used for household surveys, especially the surveys that you are going to be using, is that they are done in 2 or 3 stages. They are usually stratified, and as I was saying, they are usually stratified combining urban, rural, and region. In some cases in some countries is only done by urban-rural or only done by region, but most of the cases they combine information for both of them. And then from each strata, they select a cluster or the primary sampling unit, which is a subset within each strata. And then in the second stage, they actually pick individuals or particular households from each cluster. So as you can see, there are actually 3 stages in most cases. First, the selection of the strata, then to select clusters within stratas, and then to select people within clusters. Now what we see is that when we start using all these kinds of more complex way of samples, more complex samples, as I was mentioning before, we're actually going to need to be very careful in using weights so that we actually get final figures that are representative by region or at the national level. If we have oversampled a survey to make sure that 30% of the sample belongs to this ethnicity that had a very, very small population share, then if we don't correct that bias, at the end we're going to get figures that are not actually nationally representative. So it's very important to always use weights in the when you are trying to get your estimates out of the data that you have been cleaning and working on. Besides these kind of weights, which adjust for sampling design, sometimes there are also weights, or the weights are also adjusted in a way to correct for what we call non-response. Because we might have a design, a sampling design that is beautiful, that it's working very efficiently, that we are very proud of, and then at the time we go to the we go down to the field, we get that there are regions in which 95% of the people that were selected for the sample actually complete the questionnaires, but maybe we have another region in which only 60% of the people complete the questionnaire. So in that case, we start getting that even though they were supposed to be representative at the end, if we have a much higher non-response rate in one region than the other, then again we need to balance that out, reweighting the final data. So weights are really important to correct for a lot of these things, and you're going to find in your data sets that there's a variable already created that is called weight, and so please use it. Okay, now a few more comments about samples and subsamples. Another thing that we notice when we are working with this type of surveys is that even if I have already mentioned that, for example, for nutritional data, DHS are only covering children under 5 and women in reproductive age. But in many cases, in many surveys, like it happens in Tanzania 2010, not even all women and all children are being covered. Sometimes it's too expensive to cover them all. So what they decided to do with this particular survey was that only children from women that were selected were going to be measured for anthropometrics, for example. And only half of the women selected were going to be measured for anthropometrics. So even, after, at the end, we don't have anthropometrics measures about weight and height or BMI for all the women in reproductive age and all children under 5, but only to a subset, for a subset of them. And so we need to make sure, because for the rest of them, they're actually not, they were not selected for measures, and so in a way, we don't have information. We don't know whether they are deprived or not. And this is very important because at the end, you will also have to decide what you do with these people. Whether you drop them, whether you assume that they are non-deprived, what kind of, you're going to have to make a decision about how to treat these kind of observations. And this is something that in DHS surveys and in mix, it happens a lot, especially with nutritional samples. In the surveys that you are using, all of them have a nutritional subsample where only about half of the population, 1/3 in the case of Pakistan, had actually been measured. And so what we did was that we only kept the population that was actually measured. So now you won't have to face that problem. But in the future, when you download your own DHS and you start computing, you're going to find that there are variables that indicate that very clearly, whether they were measured or not. And another thing is that as we mentioned throughout these days, for example, when we were presenting the global MPI, for 69 countries, we were able to get subnational decompositions. Now, what happened with the other 39 countries that we had in the global MPI? Where basically these were surveys that were designed in a way that they were only nationally representative. Or in the case of Argentina, it's only urban. It's only representative at the urban level. So basically, it's also very important that you read the reports and the manuals so that you know which is the level of disaggregation for which your data is actually representative. We would all like to get district level results and create these beautiful maps, but sometimes we cannot do it because our survey was designed to be only nationally representative. And so that's also something that you are going to have to bear in mind when you work with the data. This is just to show you an example. This is a very good practice, and this is something that I was talking before about the non-response rate. What we see here is for different indicators, in DHS reports and in mix, what you're going to see is that they usually include, they usually include what's the response rate, and they have it for men, they have it for women, they have it at the household level. So it's useful for the users to know that kind of thing. And then even here, we have it by urban-rural, which is fairly similar, but then when we go at the regional level, we see that in some regions it was almost 95%, but here we have another region, the North region, in which only 77% of those selected households actually reply the, only 77 reply or were actually interviewed. So that makes that there is going to be a need to actually reweight the answer so that we get regionally represented results and we are able to compare by region. Oh, good. Now, something else to consider is what's the unit of identification. This is usually something that is usually referred to as unit of analysis, but these two things are not exactly the same. Think of the case of the global MPI. The unit of identification is actually the household. As we were talking on Tuesday, the identification of whether people are poor or non-poor happens at the household level. And then all the members of the households are equally poor or non-poor. Now, when we actually create estimates at the end and when we present our tables, we do it in terms of population. So even if the identification happens at the household level, then the analysis that we do is what's the percentage of the population that it's deprived or that it's poor or that doesn't have access to sanitation. So the unit of analysis and identification is not always the same. It could be the same, but it's not necessarily the same. So it's important to know that, because even though we might present figures that says the percentage of people that are poor or that are multidimensionally poor is 89% in Niger, actually our indicators, we need them to be accurate not at the individual level, but at the household level, because the identification happened at the household level. And so it's going to be important when you decide with your group which kind of measure you're going to create, which is going to be the unit of identification, and you're going to have to make sure that your indicators are accurate at the level of the unit of identification. So if you decide to create a child poverty measure, that it's going to be at the individual level for each child, you're going to need indicators that go to each child, to the level of each child. If you create a household indicator, you're going to need to have indicators for, if you decide to create a household level index, you're going to need to have variables or indicators that are accurate at the household level. And you're going to need to consider these things and to actually sometimes combine or adjust indicators in order to be able to get that. Something else about the accuracy of the indicators, this is something that also affects our usual socioeconomic analysis, is that when we are talking about some of the indicators in the surveys, like consumption or illnesses or time use, usually they are asked for a very short period of time. Because when we ask people how much money did you spend on food in the last year, it's most likely that they are not going to be able to remember, or they are not going to be able to give precise answers to that. So usually when we talk about consumption, we ask about the last week. When we ask about whether you were sick, we ask about the last month or the last 2 weeks, and we ask people whether they suffered any serious injury or if they were sick or things like that. And if we ask for questions about time use, it's usually about the last 24 hours. Now, the assumption behind this is that we assume that people are going to be able to have to recall better or to be more precise about how they use their time or how they spend their money for food or whether they were sick or not. Now, of course, that there could be things that affect those numbers. Because like in the examples that we have here on the slide, imagine that I ask you about last week and about your food consumption last week, and it happens that you had a family wedding or a birthday party. Then you're going to have much higher consumption than you do on average. Maybe you just happen to get the flu, but really you are a very healthy person. You don't usually get sick. Maybe you haven't been sick for years, but it just happens that you got the flu the week before you were interviewed. So these things could actually be affecting this kind of indicators because these are because we are asking for such a short time reference. Now, in the case of the aggregate measure, so if we want to create what's the average of consumption or the average time use or the average time that people spend on leisure, for example, the assumption or what we would expect is that on average we will get results that are accurate because some people might be getting sick that they are not usually sick. We could get another cases of people that get sick very often, but they just didn't happen to be sick in the last 2 weeks. Or maybe people that had a wedding and so they ate a lot, and other people that maybe were on the diet or they just happened to eat less than what they usually eat. So on average, these things kind of compensate themselves, but they are not going to be accurate at the individual level. And remember that we need indicators to be accurate at the unit of identification. So this is something that we need to bear in mind. There is no obvious way in which we can solve this because we don't really know, but there is something that is going to be affecting our results. As I was mentioning, another option would be for us to use longer reference periods, but there people could actually start being more inaccurate because they forget, because they don't have a good record of how much money they are spending, and so again we might face other types of problems of accuracy. But this is just a comment for you to know because these are all things that affect the final measure. And then okay, and then another thing that that you have already been discussing with us in the last few days, it's what do we have to do when we have some information that it's available at the individual level, some information at the household level, and then some information at the village level, for example. So this will depend on the purpose of your measure, and it will depend on what is the unit of identification that you have chosen. So for example, if in the case of the global MPI, again, we have some information that is available at the individual level, like years of education or child school attendance for children that are on the age bracket, or nutritional information for some women and some children. Now, we combine this information, this individual information, to get a household indicator, and then at the end, we bring everything at the household level. But we could also do it in the other way around, depending on which is the type of indicator that we want to create. I think this is my last, yeah.
So what's the applicable population? The applicable population of an achievement, it's the group of people for which this achievement is relevant. And this entails two conditions. First, the achievement can be measured. In other words, is conceptually relevant. I'll give examples, and so maybe. Second, it has effectively been measured. We have data. And what we're going to see, and maybe you already have seen in your data, or in your, when you start thinking about your measure, is that there's some achievements that we would like to incorporate in our measure sometimes are either conceptually or the data or empirically available just for some groups of the population. Examples. For instance, examples of achievements that are only conceptually relevant for groups of population. Income. It doesn't make sense talking about income of a 5-year-old. So, or a 70-year-old. Maybe it makes sense to some people, but not to most of them. Vaccinations. Most of our vaccinations are in our first younger years, early stages of life. So if you have an indicator of vaccination, your applicable population will tend to be children between 0 and 5. Or employment status, similar to income.
But income can be relevant to a child, because if the household income is too low, the child suffers.
Completely agree. I'm not talking about if it's relevant as in the household. Conceptually, I cannot collect data from a child on income. But I can, and this is, I think I'll cover, but I'm not sure, so I'll say it now. What we do for income, for instance, is that, yes, we collect at the household level, so we collect the household level, and we assume that it's distributed equally, and then we get to the individual. But here I'm just talking conceptual, but of course it's meta. Other case is when, yes, the achievements are conceptually relevant to the whole population, but they have not been measured. So we could measure, but we don't have the data. So it's possible, but we don't have data. And for that, it's the anthropometric measures. So we could measure the weight and the height for everyone. And for children, okay, we use the standard deviation, and for adults, we use the BMI. We could have such type of measures for all population. But when we go to practice, most of the surveys only collected for subgroups, normally under 5, sometimes all women in reproductive age, sometimes only women in reproductive age who are married, who have ever been married. So it varies. How to deal with this? And I think this is important because you are dealing with this yourselves in your measure. So, how to deal with this? The first possibility is we construct an indicator, a measure, not an indicator, a poverty measure that uses only indicators applicable to everybody, an universal measure. What's the problem of this? Is that the set of indicators that we can consider is going to be much smaller. There will be things that we cannot collect to every individual. We'll have housing conditions, we will have, I don't know, things more. If we have data, we might have nutrition information, if we have data. So, but we'll only be able to include indicators that we have for every individual and for which we have data. Other possibility is that, oh no, let's instead look just to a group of people. Let's create a group-specific poverty measure, a children poverty measure, female poverty measure, elderly poverty measure. And this can be very relevant for designing group-specific policies. So yes, children actually it's a group that lots of people are interested, and there is efforts to develop measures of children poverty. And so we just consider children. However, discriminating by groups might lessen the applicability issue, but not always solves it. In the case of children, think about children like from 0 to 18, they are not an homogeneous group. I said the vaccinations are just for young. I said school attendance are also only about 6. So it lessens, but you still might have to do some adjustments. The second problem, of course, it's good for group policies, group-based policies. But if you want to track at national level, or if you want to do targeting at the household level, the measure's not going to help you. And third, when you are compartmentalizing the population and look to separate groups, you might miss that in some households, some of the groups poor in both might be overlapping. But as you are looking to the things separately, you're not seeing, oh, in this household we actually have children poor and female poor. So it has its constraints. Finally, a possibility is to combine achievements that are not universally applicable. What do I mean? I mean that we can draw information from a subset of the household members. And I'm assuming that my unit of analysis now it's the household. So I can use indicators that are only applicable to children, but extrapolate that information at the household level. And some of you, I think, talk about this in the previous session in your groups. And that's a possibility. What I will have to do, because to do this, I will have to make assumptions. In some cases, I will have to make assumptions on how the achievements is on the intra-household distribution of the achievement, or on the externalities of the achievements. I'll show you just now. This is what we did with the MPI. So the MPI is a unit of identification, the distinction that Adriana just did, is the household. However, I have information that are about the children, attendance, nutrition. So what do we do to then, from information on the children, extrapolate to the household? For instance, in the case of the nutrition, what happens? It happens that most cases we only have data on DHS, on mix, or just for children under 5, or just for women. So what we do, we determine that a household is deprived, so our normative decision was to define the indicator that a household is deprived if there is at least one child or a woman that is undernourished. So what I'm assuming here is a negative externality. So having someone undernourished in my household, that's negative for me. In case of child mortality, also most of the surveys only have information on women. So they ask women if any of their child died. They never ask men. And sometimes maybe they are a couple and it's fine, but other cases might not be. And sometimes we only ask women in a certain age, so it might not capture all the children that were died. But we assume that if at least one of the people in the household said, oh yes, I lost a child, you are deprived on child mortality. And for school age attending of school age, attending school, we determined that if we found at least one children for which we have data in the household that is not attending school, and it should, and for us should, it's between it's at least 8 years of schooling, the household is deprived. So we assume negative externalities to make this call, how to draw the information from a subset and attribute it to my household. We could also, and we have some indicators, it doesn't have to be negative externalities. We can assume positive externalities. And we do this for the years of schooling. So we assume if there is at least one person in the household that has 5 years of schooling, everyone in the household is non-deprived. So this is based in the idea that he will share with you some of his knowledge. He will help you if you are the non-deprived. The other people who have not, you will be able to read relevant information for you. The other cases in other measures, if someone has a mobile phone, we assume that the household has a mobile phone because we assume that people share their own mobile phone. But in the case of the MPI, it's the years of schooling. We still might be confronted with some problems. This is not like everything is going to be fine. It may be that in households, no one, so achievement is not conceptually relevant for no one in that household. For instance, school attendance. But if I live with my husband and I don't have children yet, in my household, there is no one that can give an answer to that question. So how do they classify my household if I don't have no one that fits in that category? Possibilities. We can go ahead and just drop that households. So let's forget about the households that have no children in school age. That would drop lots of households. What would happen? It's the most likely would buy, like the fact that the group that has not anyone for which that achievement is relevant, it's not random. So it's normally in my case associated with some demographic structure. So if I do that, my poverty measure will not be significant. It will not be representative of the population, because most likely these two groups might be different. What can I do? I could also do, so for me, suppose like, yes, I don't have any children in school age, but I have every other indicators. So let's forget for this household the school age, and let's reweight the other indicators. So that would be a possibility. What's the problem? Forget about dimensional breakdown. Because if you remember, long ago, we talked about that the MPI was the weighted average of the censored head counts being the weight of each indicator. But now each indicator might have different weights, because in some households I readjust the weights. It was nice, but forget about it. With this case you cannot do it. Oh, I'm losing my little mic. So, what do we do with the MPI? What we have done? And we think it's maybe it's a question?
By the way, how do we define household?
MPI, that's a good question. It normally comes, I think, from the survey, so what the survey is defined. And typically, I think it is, but don't quote me, it's the people who share a meal together or from the same pan. But it comes from my data. If I my metadata, I will go to the metadata and I'll see what they define as the household. Here I'm going to keep it simple, and it's people living together. Although, also we do, nothing is simple, usual residence. So there is also the questions about who is a usual resident, and we also drop the non-usual residents because they might not be what's similar to what Adriana was saying of some events that are not typical, and they might bias. Usual residents, they are also not part of my household, so their achievements also not considered. Oh my God! So it's a follow-up of this question.
Since in the context of MPI,
Yes.
we are looking for the well-being of the family. So in many cases, for example, in the developing countries, usually one household contains several families.
Yes. No, we look at the household. And so it's true that, like I said in my case, I said me and my husband and a child. But you're right. In most of the households, it's not a couple and children. Because in lots of developing countries, in the same household live different generations. They are all part of the same household. And so,
for example, we're talking about two families, and we ask if whether, for example, for the children, at least one of them does not go to school. So if you have two families with say 5 children for each family, then who will be deprived, whether the other family or the other one?
I'm not talking about families again, so I don't know. Households.
Yeah, I mean, if in the context of the MPI.
Yes, it's
households. We're
households.
talking about the deprivation. In case if you have two families in one household.
It's the household. There is no difference for me between if it's one family, two families. For me, it's the household. Unit of identification is the household. It might include 1, 2 families, but gosh. There was a question here in the front, and then.
my question is on the same, it's almost the same question, but I'm wondering if one man has like 5 wives and they stay within the same area, does that make a household? And is there a maximum number of people that can make a household?
No. Again, it's defined on the survey, and normally if they share the meal together, they are part of the same household. There is no maximum of numbers. So it's one of the questions that some of the data that it's collected, it's about precisely what's the size of your household. And you're going to see on your data, depending on your country, you might have a big range of household size. Let's move on a little. It's about the household still. Okay.
It's just that the limit exists just for... Yeah, right.
The limit exists just for household in a house. And I think, well, I think it's the limit is 6, but 6 households by house. Because if there are more households by house, it could be a collective house, and it doesn't.
Yeah, you can have a building, but the point is if you share the meal.
Yeah.
So you can have less. Yes, it's not a house.
There are no limit for members in the household, but there is a limit for households in the house or in the building.
I can have 5 houses, same household.
No, there is no size, there is no household size that defines the definition of the household. It is that the definition is whether they share common resources, and in the DHS in the mix it's defined as food, and also how long if they are living in the household, the general usual members of the household, which is defined as how many days in a year that they spend in the household. That's usually the definition. And I think just to go back to the question about children, if there are 2 families within a household and they have 5 children each, the way the children are sampled is that from every household a random, in some cases, for some countries, all children are sampled. In some other countries, it could be that the random sample of children from the household are sampled. So what happens as a result is that you might get 2 children from this couple and another 2 children from another couple. So that is determined through sampling, which is random. So what happens as a result is that you get an idea of the general nutritional status of the children. So when you were asking that how does it happen if one couple has 5 children, another couple has 5 children, who is measured and who's not measured children? So it's just, again, children are sampled, just the way women in the household are sampled.
And so in the end, it doesn't matter who children they are. It matters if they are part of the same household. And just to wrap up this discussion, all of this is specific to each survey. So when you go, now we are talking about what's general, what we found in DHS and mix, but when you use your own survey, again I go back to what Adriana was saying, you have to go to your metadata. You have to see what's the definitions that have been used in your particular data. Here I'm just talking about generalities, and our experience is based on DHS and mix. But in your country, the definitions might be slightly different. I'm going to move on, and so in the case of a household that there is no children on school age, in the school age interval, what the MPI does is assume that this household is non-deprived. So as they don't have anyone that could answer the question, let's go ahead and assume them non-deprived. This is an assumption. So at some point, we'll have to see how this impacts our results. And I'll come to that in a little bit. Very similarly, it's what? I'll answer to that with something that my Adriana just said. Here, she didn't say with these words, but the idea was this. We are not interested on the family's achievements on average. We would like to know the real achievement. And that's why when you have those indicators that are like in the last week, we assume, oh, when you are interested in just having the average consumption for a group, that's fine, because you just say, oh, some people will over-report and others will not will underreport, and you take the average, it's fine. For poverty, I really would like to know, especially if I'm using for targeting, I really need to know what is the individual, the household level of deprivation. So I cannot take an average because that is gonna, for instance, for targeting is impossible. And otherwise it's like you might end up allocating the average is also wrong and completely bias your the joint distribution of the deprivations.
It's not average. I mean, dropping half and taking half. Because entirely assuming all of them, do not have that.
How do I choose who to drop and who to keep?
You are saying that
yes, that's better way.
You consider all that do not have that particular information as non-deprived. But instead of taking all of them as non-deprived, we could take 50% of them as non-deprived and the remaining 50% has been deprived, rather than all of them as...
No, but that's what I'm saying. You are assuming that on average that would be fine because some of them might be deprived and others will don't. And that's what I cannot do. I'm interested on the joint deprivations. So I cannot like assume like, oh, let's see, these ones are this, and no. I rather for that I'll assume something and for all will be the same, then make a, because I might end up, it's just you have to have the deprivations at your unit of identification. And so if you, because there is so many risks, you might end up assigning to people who already have more higher deprivations, to assign them as deprived, and the others that have lower, less, and you go have completely a different picture. But it's a problem. I'm not like so that's why I understand that you want to that it's everyone will want to propose how we could make it better. And so I'm not saying that this is what we found until now that seems the less problematic. But still, for each case, we need to go and look the impact of this. And this is very similar, so it's just like maybe so imagine a household, in actually, conceptually, the achievement made sense for everybody, like nutrition, anthropometric measures are conceptually relevant for everybody, but I only have data for a group. For instance, I only have data for children under 5, and it's an household where there are no children under 5. So it's very similar to the previous example, but instead of being a conceptually not relevant indicator, it's just because I don't have data for these groups, and I don't have people in the other group. What we do is the same. So on nutrition, so if the household has no members in the groups for which we have data, we assume them as non-deprived. Of course, this is what they call an heroic assumption. There might be lots of people, might be people, I don't have a kid there, it's undernourished, but I have a woman. So this is a conservative approach. So we assume like this is the lower bound. So we are not inflating poverty by assuming that they are all deprived, but we are, so it's the lower bound. I'm saying the example of the MPI with the example of this, of nutrition, but you can make the same argument on the other side, and then you will have an upper bound. This depends on the specific indicator and your context of what you are working. What's the problem of this? What's the problem of me combining information from different groups, subgroups of the household? Is like if I include an indicator of school attendance, and then I assume that every household that has no children on school attendance is not deprived, the probability of a household being poor or non-poor maybe depend of the demographic structure of the household. What do I mean? So if I have several indicators that are only relevant for some groups, there will be, for instance, children under 5 and school attendance. There will be a fraction of my sample that may be bigger or smaller depending on the demographic structure of the country. There will be automatically non-deprived in those indicators. And this might be a problem. Maybe, everyone wants to not have kids, so they're not poor. No, it's not that, but our perception of poverty might be not correct. Although, however, please, that doesn't mean that we should not include indicators that come from subsets of the household members. If there is a normative reason to include them, we should still include them. And that's why in the MPI we use. There is some conditions, or with this inclusion of these indicators, at least that should fulfill some conditions. First, we cannot include only indicators that refer to a specific group, because in that case, what would be better? Just do a group measure. So if all my indicators refer to children in school age, what's the point? Or all indicators refer only to adults, and I'm not looking to children, maybe, well, I'm not going to call it like saying that the household, I'm looking just to the adults, to the group, to a group, which is fine. But with the restrictions that we mentioned in the back, it's fine for a group measure, but don't go and call it a national measure, because your indicators are only capturing the deprivations of a specific group. So if all of your indicators are that group, that is not a national measure, that's a group measure. You also should make sure that the achievement that you pick is relevant for an important group of people. So to make sure that there is a big proportion of the households that have someone for who this achievement is relevant. For instance, when you say that children between 6 and 15, yes, you guarantee that there is a serious proportion of the households in most countries that will have at least one child. Some countries will have more or less, but they have at least one. When you put 0.5, it already depends, but there should be still lots of countries with children 0.5. Well, it should be the same more or less. I don't know. Depends on the, again, on the age structure of a country. But the point being, you want to capture a big proportion. You want to make sure that this indicator, if I'm looking just children of 0.5 and I'm saying the households, should be an indicator that I can compute for most households and not have to assume that it's non-deprived, because then I'm just looking small. However, there are indicators that are very specific, but they are intrinsically important. They may be very specific because it's something that it occurs in a specific time, or it's because it's only relevant for a small group, very small group. Like, for instance, conditions associated with pregnant women. Should we include them in our on our measure or not? So if pregnant women go to their daily checkups, daily not, regular checkups, so there is like some, they should every 3 months go to the doctor and see if everything is good with your pregnancy. So maybe that's important because I want to ensure maternal health and the child's health or the delivery of the child. But maybe the percentage of people that are having a kid this moment that I'm doing a survey might not be so big. And so by including that indicator, I'm just looking into a little proportion of the households. So maybe in that case, it's better to have an indicator at side instead of including it. Of course, you can include it and also adjust weights because you may think it's not so important. So this is only things to think about, how to deal, what are the limitations and how can you deal with it. So when it's a very specific thing, maybe just keep it on the side and report it on the side. But weights are always in a way. And of course, you should make an empirical test to show how your measure is, what's the impact of the household composition in your measure. And Sabina and Mariema have done that for the MPI. So they made a series of tests to try to assess the impact of the household composition on the MPI. First of them, they look at the differences, so test the difference between the households that were MPI poor and the households non-MPI poor in terms of a series of demographic characteristics. The household size, the number of children under 5, number of females, number of members 50 years or older, proportion of female-headed households, proportion of school-age children. And they see if there was differences. not very statistically differences. Good news, the MPI seems to be robust to this. Other thing that they did as well is that they composed the MPI by age and gender, and they rank all the countries. I don't know how many countries were at the time, but probably 100. And they looked, and so the rankings, sometimes positions might be slightly different because they might be, and they looked at the correlations, they tested the correlations between the rankings, and the correlations were high. So it seems like although the demographics can affect the correlations that we get by age, for MPI by age group, the rankings based on the MPI by age groups are not so different. And they also look to the pairwise comparisons. So what's the proportion of comparisons between two countries? That would not change. So if I look to the MPI of Colombia and IT for children, for children between 0 and 5, and in the two countries, and so children 0 to 5, and I have to have a second one, and adults 10 to 16, or children 16. I can see the pairwise, so one is poorer than the other in both cases. So that would be a robust pairwise comparison. So we saw the percentage of comparisons that would still be true depending on the different MPI that we use. So this is a kind of analysis that you could do. Similar, like this is different because cross-sectional and you have one country. But it's the first one you can do. Another problem that happens. So this is like if we have data, if the data was collected, if the thing is conceptually relevant. But there is another problem that it's more into practical, let's say. Sometimes we collected the data. So we went to the household and we tried to measure that children. But for some reason, the data was not collected. So the children or the mother refused, or no, or the mother, or they lost the data, or they put a wrong value, or they put like a weight that didn't make sense. So like sometimes so the first thing is that I don't get the data. For some reason, that question in that household was not done. I don't have the information. Maybe the interviewer forgot to ask. Can be inconsistent. So when someone went to clean the data and looks to the weight of children between 0 and 5 and find a child that weighted 150 kilos, I think maybe this doesn't make sense. Maybe this is a mistake when someone wrote the data. Let's forget about this. So to take a value that it's not plausible. And in other cases, the people said, oh, I don't know. So how many years of schooling do you have? Oh, I'm 90 years old. I don't know. I don't remember. I don't remember how many years I went to school. These are all end up being missing values. So we try to collect the data, but the people, for some reason, not the people, for some reason we don't have the data. How we should treat this? So it's not like people were not there. I cannot assume that they are non-deprived. They are there, but I don't have the information. In some specific cases, for instance, like in years of schooling, maybe I know that there was 5 kids there in years of schooling, but I only have information for the 3. The other 2, for some reason, the data is lost. What can I do in these situations? I have to get going. How can I deal with this? The first thing, when I'm designing the indicator, so when I'm thinking about the indicator, and if I'm already seeing the data, I can use, or I think, maybe if I'm not seeing the data, I can think I'm going to use a rule that allows me to assign a value even when I have some missing data. So, and the easy one is for instance, here I have years of schooling. So I want to create an indicator of years of schooling, but in some households I might only have information for one person, for the household head, or for the household and his wife, or maybe just because they didn't collect for the other people. So I have 2 people, and I know that there are more people there. How am I going to deal with this? What we did in the MPI, we said, if at least one person in the household for who I have data has at least 5 years of education, fine. I don't care if there is people that I don't have data. I found that one. I found the person. When I define the indicator, I define the indicator in a way that is at least one, fine, done. However, and if no one of my household has at least 5 years of education, but I only have data for some of them. Uh-oh. That poses a problem, because yes, every people that I'm seeing in my data, they don't have education, but there is here, like other people, that they actually might have 5 years of education, and I don't know. So what we did here, the rule was, if we have information for at least 2/3 of the household members, and they happen to all of them not having, we go ahead and we say that they are deprived. But it's a rule. It's 2/3. It allows us to not have to drop. Not have to drop, why? Because if I cannot do this, if I cannot get create an indicator that allows me to know if a household is deprived, even when I have some missing information, I will have to drop that observation. For instance, electricity. If I don't know if a household has electricity, I don't know. And I cannot create the MPI because I cannot, it's not there. Or if no one answered the attending schools question, I cannot. Why? Because remember when we had our matrix and we had like our indicators. In this example is 3 indicators. And I have some missing values there. How to deal with them? So how do I know what's the average score, the average deprivation of that person 3? I don't know. Maybe he's deprived on the first indicator, maybe not. I don't know. How do I know if he's poor? I don't know. So what happens in this case when there is an indicator? So in the first I try to design an indicator that covers my missing values. If I can't, and sometimes I can't, there is no way. Electricity, there is no data, there is no data. I have to drop that observation. So this can be a big problem. Why can this be a big problem? We know. The moment we drop some people, we might have with losing representativity. It depends. It depends that maybe the fact that I don't have information for that people was a random occurrence. So, fine. But if the characteristics of the people for who I have information and the people for who I don't have the information are systematically different, my results will be biased. Okay. What can we do? What can we do? A bias analysis. So normally this drop on the sample is associated, like the big drops tend to be associated with few indicators. Most cases, nutrition. Nutrition, maybe because it's hard to collect the information, is a good candidate for missing values. And so when we have, like, we identify nutrition is a problematic indicator. We have, it leads to, we lose 10% of our sample. What do? We go to the other indicators and we compare the people we are dropping and the people we are keeping. And we see if in the other indicators they are very different or not. I go to electricity, to the household standards, to the education, and I do a means testing of the proportion to see if the proportion of the deprived in the other indicators is the same or not. Basically, just that. The results, if I find no significant difference, is awesome. So it means that, yes, it's missing at random. So I don't know, like, this was it happens, but the people are systematically similar or identical on average. Like, so that I don't find that one group is more deprived in lots of indicators than the other. So, good, I can use the reduced sample. I still should report the percentage of people that I'm dropping. So I should still say, oh, by the way, when I present my results, there was 10% of the sample that went off. So the people can see. Yes?
Yeah, but it's really hard decision to drop observations and maybe the alternative to use is imputation.
I can say a little bit about that next. I was not going to plan, but since you bring I can say a little bit about that. So, assuming imputation is a step further, so I'll talk a little bit about that next. But otherwise, I don't have option, because if I don't have data, I don't have data. So I have to drop them. So it's not really an option. It's once I define the indicators, I can, if it's before, I can say, oh, this indicator is a problematic one.
It's going to be a good decision to drop, unless otherwise you are really convincing.
No, but yeah, it's good because like that then everyone needs. I'm not saying that it's an easy decision, But I'm saying just like, it will happen. Depends on on the percentage of people. It's always going to happen that you'll have some missing observations. And so what you can do before, if you are designing the variable and you know that an indicator will be very problematic, yes, you should think twice. It might be very important, but you know that you're never going to be able to have accurate data. Maybe you shouldn't include it. But once you decided to include it, it's going to happen. It might be in a bigger or smaller percentage, but there is no perfect data set. So there will be always some observations that, and it's enough that I don't have for one indicator, as I said, like you might have everything else. You don't have that, I cannot include. I wish I could, so I cannot. So this is what I do to see what's the impact of dropping them. And but if it's good news, if I don't find statistical significant differences in their deprivations, it seems that, yes, it happens. So it was a mistake that didn't happen systematically. It's something that, if there is, I still can do something. I can still use that sample and say, this is so the direction of the bias. So yes, so I compare these two, the people for who I have data and the people for who I don't have data, and I find out that the people for who I don't have data tend to be always more deprived than these, and these. So my measure is probably being a lower bound, because as I'm ignoring this set of people that tend to be more deprived, I'm not seeing the real picture. I'm seeing the minimum, or close to the minimum. So since, yeah, I had planned to end there, but since I've got a little thing, can I open this like this, or I have to? Yes. About imputation, yes, that's true. In income, when in poverty, they use imputation lots of times, so it's practical. So what is the imputation? So they have a model where the achievement is the explanatory variable. And they estimate the achievement in a set of, it's the explained variable. So it's the dependable variable. And they regress this in a set of covariates, in a set of explanatory variables. For the people for who we have information. And then we predict the achievement for the people for who we don't have information. So we have to make sure that our explanatory variables, we at least have information. So we can regress sanitation on, I don't know, I never did for sanitation, but on the location, because maybe some locations have higher probability of having or not, on consumption, if I have data, go lucky if you do, on other electricity, on a set of variables that you should have data for, the ones that you don't have sanitation. And then you predict. You use the parameters of that regression, and you go to the people you don't have electricity, and you predict. You say, oh, the predictive value of electricity is this, so this person should be deprived or not. And they do that for income. When we go to multidimensional poverty, this is much more problematic. And in truth, there is not yet a good answer, because there needs further research. Problems, first, and these problems happens always. By definition of using imputation, the model needs to be accurate, or otherwise you might be messing even more. The problem also, but this is general. When you go to multidimensional poverty, you want the joint distribution. So of deprivation. So if you do different models for different deprivations, your results, like there is here, you are losing the joint, because you are assuming that things are not related, and they may be related. So ideally, you would predict a vector of deprivations. But still, this is also problematic for something like, we need it to be accurate at the household level. I don't want an average. I have to be really accurate. And also, don't go ahead. And so this is not being done, and we don't see now yet how can be done properly. And the final point is just like, this also doesn't solve the non-applicable populations. So you cannot go estimate nutrition for women above 50 if you don't have information for no women above 50. So this is not a solution for that. This is another issue. This is just for the missing values. So my answer is, I see lots of problems, but there is needs for further research, so we'll go ahead and try to apply it. And I think that's it. No, it's not mine. Okay, a question.
In most of the demographic health surveys these days, they have household questionnaire as well as the individual questionnaire. And I believe in the MPI calculations you use mostly the household questionnaire, no?
No. We merged
it.
all, yes, all that needs say. We use the household, we use the women, we use the child, and we use the man. Because normally, these 4 recodes, that's normally the ones where the relevant information for the MPI come from.
Okay, so good to know that. That means, suppose questions like, ask to women, do you have access to contraception, or do you use contraception or something?
They are not in the MPI, but they are available. But they are not in the MPI.
If I want to use that kind of information, we can.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So, good one. It's a question? No.
No, I was just saying that access to contraception by women doesn't tell you the whole story. Eh?
There isn't, sorry?
Men also.
Yes, that's the kind of discussions that you have to have in your group and think about the implications of such indicator for your measure. Have a good lunch.